Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. In the interest of time, we will get started, despite our little snafu on bringing everyone in. For those who don't know me, I think almost everyone does. My name is Dawn Friesen. I am the 2021 chair of the Greater Houston section of the American Chemical Society, and I'm very pleased to have with us tonight Dr. Allison Campbell to present our seminar. Dr. Campbell earned her PhD in physical chemistry from the State University of New York at Buffalo and a BA in chemistry from Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania. As a researcher, she is nationally recognized for her research in biomaterials. She is credited with co-inventing a process to grow a bioactive calcium phosphate layer onto the surfaces of artificial joint implants and is recognized for her work in understanding the role of proteins in biomineralization. At the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, Dr. Campbell launched and led the Earth and Biological Sciences Directorate and served for more than 10 years as the director of the Environmental Molecular Sciences Laboratory. Her most recent role at PNNL was as the Associate Laboratory Director for Coastal and Marine Sciences, from which she recently retired. Dr. Campbell was elected and served as president of the American Chemical Society in 2017, as well as serving on the ACS Board of Directors. And she is an avid promoter of science education, sharing enthusiasm for her field with students through a number of hands-on educational programs. She has also testified before the House of Representatives Committee on Science and Technology regarding the value of research at DOE labs. We are very happy to have Dr. Allison Campbell here with us today to talk about her experiences in chemistry and science advocacy. So welcome, Allison, and I will turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Don. Okay, so since I've retired, I haven't done a lot of Zoom meetings, so let's see if I can remember how to do this. Share screen. You guys all see that?
We are seeing, there we go.
Oh, okay, well, so I appreciate the opportunity. Wish I could be there in person enjoying the warm weather, but maybe someday we'll get down to Houston. So I thought, as Don said, I would talk about a little bit about my research efforts, particularly in biomaterials, and then spend a good portion of the talk talking about science advocacy, which is something that's still very important to me, and which was a major pillar of my presidency with the ACS. And we went and developed a course of which you're going to see a lot of the material here today, so you kind of get the course without having to go to the course. Let's see. Okay, let me go back. I wanted to start just by acknowledging that everything that you do, or everything that I do, is never done in a vacuum, but it takes a village. And I've had that fortune over the last 30 years that I was a practicing chemist to work with some amazing folks, many have shown here. And I think one of the things that I like to tell young people who are getting into science is it's easy to talk about how great science is and how fun and all of the fun that you have. But there's one thing that I tell them that they don't really realize, and that is that you have the opportunity in science to work with so many wonderful people across the world and across the nation. And so science, what I tell them is it really opens up the world to you. You have the opportunity to go, to meet people, to collaborate with people, to share your information. And as you can see, these folks are from all over the United States and even into Canada as well. And so I just wanted to start by acknowledging their contributions to the work, because everything I show you is a result of their efforts as well. Let's see. Okay, a little bit on jargon, because we all speak even though we're all scientists, we all speak our own language, and it's easy to get confused. So I did research in basically 3 main areas throughout my career. I did my PhD work and early work at PNNL on biomineralization, which is really understanding the natural processes by which organisms produce minerals. You can see a nice seashell there. They use proteins as templates to then lay down the calcium carbonate. And it's a very elegant and precise process that's carried out at ambient conditions, water as a solvent and room temperature, but under long time scales, if you're thinking about, synthetic processes. Biomimetics is the field of actually mimicking what biology does so eloquently, and taking those lessons from nature, how proteins facilitate mineralization, for example, and making artificial constructs then that you can do in the lab and maybe speed up the process while maintaining those nice attributes of water as a solvent, room temperature types of things in the processes. And then in my research, I took that biomimetic process and then applied it to something that was important to me, which is biomaterial, which is essentially any substance that's been engineered to be put in the body and reside within living systems. A lot of people know of artificial knees and hips, but there's stents and all kinds of things, clips and pins and things that go into the body that are considered biomaterials. Okay, so in thinking about biomaterials, and in particular orthopedic biomaterials, historically plasma spraying, which is a high temperature vapor deposition process, was the way in which calcium phosphate coatings were produced. And calcium phosphate, and in particular, I'm going to move everybody over here so I can see the title of my slide. In particular, hydroxyapatite, which is the main mineral found in bone, was produced through this process. And, you know, it provided some bioactive capacity in that it did show some ability to stimulate bone formation. But the problem with plasma spraying is there's three problems, as I show here. One is it's a line of sight process. It's actually like spray paint in some ways. And so if you have a porous implant or that has voids or cavities, you can see here on these beads, this coating has basically clogged those pores. And so you lose the porosity or the porous nature of the material by coating it with this via this method. Lots of times these films tend to be amorphous and not crystalline. And in their amorphous nature, they also tend to be multi-phase. And so lots of times you'll get hydroxyapatite, but you'll get another material, oftentimes a material called tricalcium phosphate that is highly soluble, and when it dissolves tends to be fairly acidic and then causes local trauma is maybe not the right word, but it changes the pH locally and affects the cells that are growing around it. And then, of course, it can crack and delaminate. It's not well adhered to the substrate of the metal of the implant in this case. And so the challenge has always been, how does one get a hydroxyapatite coating that overcomes some of these limitations of plasma spray in an economical, feasible manner? Okay, well, I want my slide advance. There we go. So what we did in our lab was we applied what we were doing in biomimetic sciences to the application of biomaterials. And so through our research in biomineralization, we learned that the proteins that facilitate mineralization tend to be the acidic amino acid proteins. And the acidic amino acids, parts of those proteins. So your carbonates, your phosphonates, those sorts of things, your sulfonates. And so what we did was we said, well, okay, can we create that, that functionality on a surface without having to use a protein? And so we turned to the self-assembled monolayers as our template that we would put on the surface of these metal implants. And basically take these, put a sulfonate on the end. They tended to be between 11 and 18 methylene units in length. Through van der Waals interactions, these things essentially stand up like trees in the forest, fairly tightly packed on the surface. The sulfonate is the top of the surface. The silicon then binds to the oxygen or the oxide layer of the metal through a silicon oxygen bonding, and we've been able to show that you get either get the tri-bonding or bidentate bonding on the surface, and then some cross-linking, which adds some strength and stability to the self-assembled monolayer. And then when you put these into supersaturated solutions, you can get films to form, essentially, mimicking the protein layer in these, natural systems, if you will. And in many cases, you can control if you have the sulfonated or the acidic functionality just in certain regions, and then say a methyl terminated SAM in other regions, you only get precipitation where you want it. And so that is the biomimetic process that we developed in our lab, and then, you know, patented and then applied into the biomaterials space. So this is the actual way in which we did it. We used titanium as our substrate because that's what metal implants are typically made out of. We actually got from some doctors down there in San Antonio some external fixator pins that are more chromoly in their makeup as well to use. We put them in a substrate. We put them in with a 1% self-assembled monolayer solution. You basically rinse them, and this was a vinyl terminated SAM. You rinse it, you hit it with a little SO3 gas, rinse it off again, and you've sulfonated it. And that's the simple process for essentially creating that self-assembled monolayer on the surface of the implant surface. I seem to be missing some slides, but we'll keep going. So once we did that and we got the hydroxyapatite to form, the next thing to do was to confirm that it would actually facilitate bone growth. And so this was work that we did actually up at the University of Toronto with a scientist up there named John Davies, where we basically took these nodules or these samples and put them into a culture of osteoblasts and waited 9 to 12 days. And what you see is on the right hand upper scanning electron micrograph is you can see the bare substrate on the bottom. You can see the film, the calcium phosphate film, which is in this case is partially delaminated, and that happened, we confirmed after when we were preparing the sample for SEM. And then you can see sort of what looks like rods on the top of that, and that is collagen formation and the precursor to bone formation. And then the bottom film, you can really see the hydroxyapatite crystals there. They look like plates, rosettes, maybe similar to what you would find in a rose, for example. And then you can see bone on top of that, and then the collagen fibrils on top of that. So we were really able to confirm in vitro that we were getting bone formation on these calcium phosphate coatings. We also did this experiment where we fed the culture some tetracycline, which is basically just a it's a antibiotic, but it also fluoresces and gets incorporated with the bone material, and so it, under a certain light it shows as yellow, and then you can start to see essentially between the control and the samples at 9 and 12 days a fair amount of bone formation forming on these samples. So that's all good news, works well, you know, in a petri dish. Next step is to figure out if it works well in an organism. And so this is where we went down to the University of Florida as well as the Medical College of South Carolina and did some in vivo work in rabbits and in rats. And basically we took the implant, coated and uncoated. So one side of the animal got a coated implant, one side of the animal got an uncoated implant. And we let them go for 12 weeks in the animal, and then looked at the amount of bone formation around the implant. And so on the left, what you see is the black is essentially the cross section of the implant that went into the animal. And you see that dark red ring and all of that, that is bone that has formed very tightly bound into the implant coating after 12 weeks. On the right-hand side, what you see is the implant. You see some white, which is a void, and then you see light pink. Light pink is indicative of fibrous tissue, and this is fairly common in these native metal implants where the natural response of the body is to essentially put fibrous tissue around it because the body is recognizing the titanium as a foreign body. And just like when you get a splinter, sometimes it festers, puffs up and festers before it pops out. That's basically the body walling it off with fibrous tissue, saying, no, 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 this is not natural. And I need to do something about it. And so it forms this fibrous tissue. Well, maybe that's okay, but what happens in an implant, especially a load-bearing implant, is since it's not tightly bound to bone, over time, since the fibrous tissue is fibrous and has motility, the implant will move and ultimately lead to failure. And then, of course, we've quantified the amount of bone that has grown as a course of that, and demonstrated that the coatings showed more bone formation than the non-coated over a square area. Sorry about the dog, but that's the way it goes with Zoom meetings. So, hey, sorry. So then what we did was we went down to Texas, actually, and worked with some folks at the Madigan Army Medical Hospital in San Antonio. And at that time, it was Desert Storm was going on, and they wanted to really look at our process for use in external fixation, which is basically, as you can see, and I'm sorry for the graphic photograph, but it really does show the challenge here. Fractures were being set in the field externally, and so this soldier here has a fracture of his lower leg, and then pins go on either side of the fracture, and the rod goes on the outside of the leg, thus stabilizing it. And a lot of this, as you can see in the upper picture, is done in the field or in a hospital that's near the field in fairly unsanitary conditions. And, you know, I don't know the last time you saw a surgeon that wore a sidearm, but, you know, there you have it out in the field putting these pins in. But they do become infected because, especially when you're putting them in a less sterile environment, even when you're putting them in the OR, they can become infected. And about 6% of those infections can lead to hospitalization. And basically what happens is the pin tract will loosen over time and cause destabilization of the fracture. So they wanted to try our process to see if it could address the problem that they were having. So we basically adapted our process to add an antimicrobial agent on it. And so we basically used chlorhexidine. That's what they wanted to use. So after we grew the film, we exposed the film to chlorhexidine. And then what we did was put a lipid layer on top of that, and I'll explain that in a minute. If you look at the graph there, we measured the release rate of chlorhexidine over time, and you can see that there was a fairly rapid release over about the first 24 hours, and then it was constant after that. And without the lipid layer, what we found is that the release of the chlorhexidine was over the course of a couple of hours. And so by adding a lipid layer that was hydrophobic, it just delayed the release once these things were inserted, so that you had a more steady release than just sort of that rapid release of the chlorhexidine. So then, of course, we go back to the Indivo in vitro sorts of things to look and see whether or not it's working. And the micrograph on the left shows a pin that has the coating only, one with chlorhexidine and one with chlorhexidine on the lipid, just plopped onto a culture of Staph aureus. And you can see the kill zone that formed after 48 hours on this microbial mat, essentially. None in the untreated, some pretty good in the chlorhexidine hydroxyapatite. And then when you have that lipid and that more sustained release, you get a better kill zone there. And then, of course, in vivo, what we did down there was put these external fixator rods into sheep. Each sheep, as you can see from this surgical picture here, got two 2 rods inserted on a limb, a hind limb. And then what we did was we didn't just hope for infection, we dribbled staph areas down the pin tract itself to cause an infection. So we really facilitated these things becoming infected. And then after a couple of weeks, every day the animal was brought in and evaluated by MDs, and basically looked to see whether or not the tract site was infected. And we had basically, we did cultures and we had a threshold number for what was considered infected and not. And then in one case, we saw colonies on the culture, but it didn't meet our threshold. And so you can see basically 20 out of the 24 implants remained uninfected. 3 had these colonies, but didn't meet the threshold, and 1 met the threshold for our definition of infected. So outstanding results in vivo versus the pins that weren't coated, every single one of them infected. And so we had really great efficacy for the implants. And so the docs down there were ecstatic. So that's basically the research, and basically what is the rest of the story is that the process has been licensed to a company in Montana, and they're working through the FDA process and working on this process for getting them out into the sector. So I'm going to shift now to the advocacy part and just talk a little bit about advocacy, how one can get engaged, the do's and don'ts for advocacy, and those sorts of things. And if all goes well, we'll show a couple of short little videos. And if they don't go well, Dawn has the videos, and so you can watch them at some other time. So I think we all know this, Congress isn't inherently savvy. I just looked up the number of PhDs in Congress the other day on this sitting Congress, and I think there are 3 in the hard sciences if you include MDs in that. So there's 2 MDs, and those are on the Senate side, and 1 individual who got hit. So there's 2 more. There's 1 individual with a PhD in mathematics and 1 with a PhD in physics. And so, you know, Congress just isn't inherently savvy. They're mostly folks who are lawyers, political science majors, maybe the social sciences. My representative is actually a farmer. He's a smart guy, but he's a farmer, and he's self-admitted doesn't know much about science. And so it falls on us as scientists to really talk about science and advocate for it in ways that the folks on the Hill understand and see the value. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit here. Of course, there's a lot of ways that science and policy intersect. Obviously, the one that rises to the top is the federal funding of research. But as we've seen more and more recently, there are issues around environmental and climate policy and the intersection with science. STEM education has been a big one. More and more immigration is coming to the forefront, and the ability to bring folks in. And then, in the past, peer review has been something that Congress has looked at as something that they think they might want to be interested in taking a look at. So, how to engage? Well, everybody also thinks that you need to engage at the national level, and that's certainly very important in talking to Congress and or various government agencies. But there are a lot of things happening at local and state levels where you can get involved, whether they're your local assemblages or Congresses, agencies there, school boards, city councils. So there's lots of rooms to both practice advocacy, but also lots of areas where advocacy is needed, whether it's in your own town, your state, or at the national level. Try to get them to corral those dogs. You can also go various places to meet your elected officials. Obviously, DC is an area where you would want to go. But I have found that more often than not, the best place to meet your representative is at their district office. You'll have a much better chance of actually meeting the member themselves rather than a member of their staff. There's less pressures on their time, so they're more apt to listen. It's just really an awesome environment for engaging with your federal officials. But you can also go to their fundraisers. They're all trying to get reelected and holding fundraisers locally, so you can go to those and talk to them there. And then there are other organized events that are out and around, whether they're in state or at the national in Washington D.C., where there's opportunities to engage. And this photo, it just happens to be at a science expo that was up on Capitol Hill a couple of years ago, where members of Congress came by. So I want to start with a video, and I hope this works, with sort of a really nice example of what not to do when engaging your members. And I apologize in advance, it's kind of grainy, the sound quality isn't great. I hope this works. Tell me if it, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if it doesn't on your Zoom link. And it's very dated, but let's give it a whirl and see if it works. Okay.
Joy, we're a guest from the National Association of Chemists. I'm going to have to get over and vote pretty soon.
Sir, I'm not sure. Let me see if they called and rescheduled. I'll be right
I
back.
just don't understand people being late on time. You'd think scientists would be a lot more precise.
Sir, your 1 o'clock is here?
Oh, Congressman, nice to meet you. I'm Jonathan Franklin. We were a little late. We had a meeting that kept going on, and I had to get some coffee.
I had a chair. That's all very interesting, but we're already late. So let's get going now. How can I help you? That's the most important thing I want.
Congressman, I'm Professor Douglas Nickleby from MWSU. I want to tell you about some really groundbreaking research we're doing in catalysis using high oxidation state metal oxo compounds.
I'm sure it is, but boy, I don't even understand half of it. But I need to know, how can I help you?
Wow, so you work here? I was expecting someone a lot older.
You look very young. Do you have a science degree?
Let me tell you about Joy. Joy is so special. She's a Harvard graduate. She handles a wide range of very important issues for me. And one of the things you have to learn about Capitol Hill is the staff up here, just not a bunch of aides running around shuffling paper. They're highly competent professionals. Joy handles a wide range of issues, including science and the issues so important to you. So why don't you tell us how we can help you?
NAC is a huge organization of chemists. We were founded in the late 1800s sometime, and we focus on scientific research, and we want more money from the federal government.
How many constituents in my district?
Well, 1,000, maybe 2,500. I'm not really sure.
But let me give you a tip. I would suggest you be more precise about that. I mean, if I said you've got over 2,000, then I could be precise with that. Boy, that's very important to my district and the people I represent. So you've got to give me the weapons, for my arsenal so that I can fight your battles for you.
Well, Congressman, we're here today to educate members of Congress about the importance of research funding. It's very important.
I know it's very important. I mean, look, I'm chairman of the Science Committee, and we passed very important legislation to authorize these programs. I understand that. It enhances
I can't overemphasize how important it is for the Congress to pass this legislation to increase the funding for NSF and the other R&D agencies. It's just essential that you work hard to get this to happen.
Professor, let me tell you. I, once again, am chairman of the Science Committee. We advanced this legislation through our committee. Legislation to put the science funding on a trajectory to double the budget over the next several years. I understand it. You don't have to convince me. But that's only part of the job. And get authorization through the Science Committee. Now you have to deal with the Appropriations Committee. That is the other part of the equation, because an authorization without an appropriation means zip, nothing. So what's your strategy for dealing with the appropriators?
Well, we're primarily focused on working with the Science Committee because you guys do represent science, right? We don't have a plan to work with the appropriators. Maybe we should.
Okay, so as you can see, you know, there was that did not go well for that group. They didn't get their message across. They were unprepared. They didn't understand the process by which bills get authorized and then get appropriated. So they didn't have a strategy for how to handle that. And so what I want to do is just sort of walk through how to make this a success, so that when you go and meet with your representative or your legislator, you're prepared and have the best chance of having a good, successful meeting. So the first thing is to obviously know who you're talking to. I think that's fairly basic and most people can do it. Then you got to schedule a meeting, and then you got to know who your audience is. So half the time, especially in DC, when you meet with when you schedule a meeting, you're not going to meet with a member. You're probably going to meet with a member of his or her staff. And depending upon your topic, you know, and especially on the Senate side, but to a lesser extent on the House side, they will have staff in certain sectors. In my representative, farming, science, energy, you know, a couple of others. And she'll probably meet with the staff who are responsible for that part of the portfolio as well. So know your audience. You got to go in there with an ask. It's not a howdy doody, but you have a purpose. Ask for more funding for research. Talk about climate change and its impacts and what you want them to do. You know, you want them to vote a certain way, or you want them to push a certain piece of legislation. Don't speak down to them, speak simply to them. These are smart, educated individuals. They just don't have a science background. So speak to them like an adult, and don't speak down to them. And I'll give you some examples of that. You got to be incredibly flexible. Sometimes you're walking and talking. Sometimes you're meeting in a broom closet, and I'm not kidding. Sometimes you're meeting in the cafeteria. You have to be flexible, because they're late for a vote, you got to walk and talk, or a conference room is taken, you got to stand out on the hall. Don't be put off by that. That's just normal business for them. Obviously, a thank you is important, and nothing's better than a follow-up email or handwritten note to say thank you, and then of course always follow up. And so I'm going to walk through these. Maybe. Here we go. Okay, so setting up the meeting is fairly straightforward. If you get online to your representative or legislature, you can figure out who the person is that is their scheduler. The first thing to do is to get on the congressional calendar and a hold of that and find out when, if you're going to go to DC, when they're in session. Then you tell them who's going to attend. So it's Allison's going to attend with Lisa Houston, and she's from Houston and Allison's from Richland. Just give them a little background information. And then you start, once you got it scheduled, you start preparing for your meeting. Know your audience. So this is the standard way an office is structured in a congressman's or a woman's office or a senator's office. They have a chief of staff who's basically responsible for running the office. And then under that individual is a press secretary, a legislative director, an office manager, and a scheduler. And then basically under the legislative director, this is where these aides are that are in a certain domain areas. And chances are those are the individuals, when you schedule a meeting with your legislator, that you will be meeting with. You probably won't meet with anybody from the right hand or the left hand side, the press secretary, the office manager, or the scheduler. The other thing to know about these people is that most of the folks that you'll be meeting with are, at least certainly on the House side, less so on the Senate side, are interns. They're there for a short period of time. They're young. They're in their mid to late 20s. They tend to go from member to member and aren't full-time staff. That's all okay, because while they're working for the individual person, they are totally and 100% representing the interest of the legislator that they're working for. So don't be put off by the fact that they're interns. Don't be put off by the fact that they're young. they are smart and engaged. So, but know who you're going to be meeting with as you go. Okay, know your ask. So you're going there for a purpose. It's not just a howdy doody. What they expect you to ask them to do something for them. That's expected. So don't disappoint them. Okay, and then your ask can have various forms. You support for or opposition against a piece of policy or legislation. You can ask for funding, appropriations, those sorts of things. The other thing you can ask them to do is to join a caucus. So we, for instance, coming from a national lab, there's actually a national lab caucus. These are basically, I'll use the word club. It's not a club, but it's a group of like-minded representatives or senators that get together around various common interests. And they can be partisan, but more than likely they're bipartisan. So you can get members from both sides of, from both political parties on these caucuses. There is a chemistry caucus on both the Senate side and the House side. So one of the things that you guys down there could talk about is to see whether or not your senators and or the representative from the greater Houston area are members of that caucus. And you could go to the local district when they're home and invite them to join that caucus. You'd get a little information about it, who's members, who were the chairs, how it functions, and then talk to them about the importance of it. And that's a great thing to do because the ACS definitely engages with members of that caucus to get information about things that are affecting the chemical and chemistry enterprise. Okay, so the big day's arrived. A couple of the basics. Capitol Hill is inherently formal, and so you need to dress appropriately. Typically, all of the men will be wearing ties, and the women, slacks and a nice blouse, those sorts of things. Obviously, if you don't have a tie or a suit, you don't have to wear it, but dress as professionally as possible. Be on time and be flexible. So you need to be on time. They may be late. That's okay. Be flexible about it. And then, of course, be prepared. Practice clear communications. And I think this is something that you have to practice and practice and practice. And one of the strategies that we've always done before we go on the Hill is we go to the cafeteria before our meeting and we run through our spiel with each other. Who's going to say what are the handoffs? And we really try to hone and be crisp and clear about what it is that we're going to say. This is something that requires practice. And so we practice before, and then afterwards we say, what could we have done better? Okay, so start with the why, not the what. I want more funding. Well, why? Why do you want more funding? Or I want to support this bill on climate change. Why? Well, Houston's underwater. Maybe that's the why. I mean, think of your why, not the what. Establish context. Words do have meaning. So I'm a cyclist. Cycling means something different to me than it does to my soil scientist friends, where cycling means an elemental cycling in the soil. And so you can't take it for granted that they understand the words that you're using because they have multiple contexts. I remember the first time I went on the Hill, I was the director of one of DOE's user facilities where scientists go and take measurements. And I was talking about, this user facility, blah, blah, blah. And it finally dawned on me about halfway through the discussion that they thought I was talking about a rehab facility, a drug rehab facility. Never even occurred to me going in there that the word user had a different connotation. And so you really have to think about these things and make sure that you understand that, cycling is, we're talking about elemental cycling, not talking about riding down the road on the bike. Connect chemistry to everyday life or whatever it is that you're talking about, and, try to show how it impacts them and their constituents. And then use the pause, let them talk, because they'll talk, they'll ask questions. So tee them up, but then let them ask the questions that they need to ask to get the information they need to be as successful as they can for you. All right. Be flexible. Delays happen for a variety of reasons. Meetings happen in different places. This is an actual picture of Laura Pence, who was on the board with me for a while at the same time at ACS, having a meeting with her member out in the hall because there was no other place to meet. And so I think it's a lovely picture, but you have to be flexible and you have to be willing to stand on your feet and shuffle things around and walk and talk and all of those things. That in no way is an indication that they don't value what you have to say. It just means that, you know, it's busy there and they don't have a lot of space. And so you just got to be as flexible as you can. And, you know, if they have to cancel the meeting, you're just gracious about that and try to set up a new one at some point. And then, of course, follow up. So send a thank you note to the members and the staffer. If there's materials that they've asked for, make sure they get them within a week of when you've met with them. One of the things I always like to do, especially with my Congress member, is he is a farmer. He doesn't know, you know, he doesn't understand a lot about what we do at the National Lab. So I offer my services. I said, if you need advice on something, he said, you know, I'm here to help, and just offered some technical assistance. If you think other materials are helpful, you can send those along. Hit them up in the district office, and then, you know, invite them when they're in district. Try to have an event that, you know, at your local section, and invite them to come down and meet the members at the local section. Lots of times they'll come. There's other ways. ACS puts on the Science in the Congress event, which is pretty good, and it's, if you can have the opportunity to attend one of those, that's also another way to go and invite them to go to one of those events as well. So let's watch the video now that people have sort of got some training, and see how they do.
Okay, I think we're ready. As we discussed at a conference call, we'll introduce ourselves individually, and then I'll explain to the congressman why we're meeting with him today, and then we'll reiterate the importance of science funding to him.
All right, and then I will explain to him what my DOE-supported research on catalysis is and try and quickly give a big picture example.
Great.
And I'll share with him how NSF funding has helped science education in my high school. And then we have to remember to ask him specifically to work with appropriators to help secure funding for the 3 priority research agencies.
Congressman, the group from the American Chemical Society is here.
Well, thank you, Congressman, for your time.
Thanks. Well, excellent. I really appreciate your being here a little bit early because it gives us some more time. The schedule is very tight today, and I expect to be summoned to the floor any minute now for some votes. So let's get right to business. How may I help you in the American Chemical Society?
Congressman, we appreciate the time that you and your staff has taken today to meet with us. First, let's introduce ourselves, and then we'll get to our message today. My name is Jonathan Franklin, and I'm Chief Technology Officer at Energy Safe, back home in your district. We work with the National Institutes of Standards and Technology to develop the metrics to improve alternative energy manufacturing. Here's my card. Colleague here.
Congressman, I'm Douglas Nickleby. I'm a professor of chemistry at Midwest State University. And I'd like to tell you about, we're doing some really exciting work on catalysis that's funded by the Department of Energy. This work is developing new procedures for carrying out chemical transformations at low temperatures so that we're using less energy and we're producing fewer pollutants.
And Congressman, my name is Frances Dugan. I'm a high school chemistry teacher in your district. And I work mostly with children from lower income households and populations that are underrepresented in the sciences. I just actually want to let you know, we have been able to build this wonderful hands-on laboratory program through the NSF PALS program grant. This has really sparked interest in chemistry. And as a result, student enrollment has increased about 30%.
You may be aware that the American Chemical Society is the world's largest scientific society. We have more than 160,000 members, and professional chemists and chemical engineers. We were founded in 1876, and in 1937 we were chartered by Congress. Back home in your district, we have 420 chemists and chemical engineers. And they asked me to ask you if you're willing to come out and speak to them during one of their monthly meetings.
Well, I'd love to do that. So, you know, when I'm back home in the district, Joy will give you the name and number of contacts. You can invite me, and be glad to do it.
Congressman Bullard, thank you very much for your leadership and shepherding the Science Advancement Act through Congress. Your role as chair of the House Science Committee is greatly appreciated. This bill will go a long way in enhancing U.S. innovation and competitiveness. It really shows a forward thinking on our needs for our country's future. Thank you very much.
Well, you're most welcome, and it's very nice to meet everyone here. You've done a real good job of making your presentations, and I really appreciate getting to know a little bit about each of you and what you're doing. Especially delighted to know how the programs we've authorized as part of the Science Advancement Act are being utilized in your classrooms, in your laboratories, in your businesses, how they operate in the real world. As chair of the House Science Committee, I know how important strong federal research and science programs are to our future global competitiveness. And the Science Advancement Act, as you well know, it deals with NIST, it deals with the Office of Science, Department of Energy, it deals with the National Science Foundation. It puts all these very important agencies on a path to double their funding over the next several years. But to fully implement these programs, we will need to make sure these programs are fully funded this fiscal year and for the foreseeable future.
Okay, so I mean, obviously much better. What do? They practiced before they went in. So they knew what they were going to say. They actually started with a thank you, which I think is a really great thing. Thanking them for something they had done prior. They talked about the challenges and why this piece of legislation needed to come together. And they let him do a lot of the talking, and you can really learn a lot in that. And so I think they had a very successful engagement with that member of Congress because they were prepared and knew what they wanted to do. So I think that's all I've got, except to say, remember that everyday scientists have a voice, and there's Laura Pence and I on one of our trips to DC for ACS. It's really, I can't tell you, it's really important to advocate, and I think it's really important to try to get with your members, particularly in the district, invite them out to some of your meetings once we have meetings in person, and just start to foster a relationship with your members of Congress. With that, I'll say thanks, and I'll stop my sharing and take any questions that you have on any topics. Everything's fair game for me. So I really appreciate it.